I have a rendezvous with death. We'll preserve the last best hope of man on earth, or we'll sentence them to take the last step into 1,000 years of darkness.
No fear. No political correctness. No wokeism. You're listening to Underground USA.
President Donald Trump, in his relentless pursuit of a leaner, more efficient federal government, faces a formidable obstacle: the insidious tandem of judicial activism and anti-DOGE Democrat politicians. These forces, cloaked in sanctimonious rhetoric about protecting workers and preserving institutions, are hell-bent on thwarting his agenda to downsize bloated government agencies and eliminate redundant federal jobs, not to mention fraud and graft. The federal courts, increasingly a playground for partisan tyrants masquerading as impartial arbiters, have repeatedly overstepped their constitutional bounds to block Trump's efforts. But Trump, more of a shrewd tactician than the far left suspects, has a card up his sleeve: the power to transfer non-compliant and shielded federal employees to the most undesirable corners of the country, effectively forcing them to quit. This strategy, while ruthless, could be the key to dismantling the entrenched bureaucracy and restoring accountability to a government long overrun by unelected busybodies. The federal judiciary's descent into unconstitutional activism has reached a fever pitch since Trump returned to the White House. Judges, many appointed by Democrat predecessors with an eye toward preserving the administrative state, have issued injunctions and rulings that defy both logic and the will of the electorate. Take, for instance, Trump's push to streamline agencies like the Environmental Protection Agency or the Department of Education, entities that have ballooned into inefficient behemoths, churning out regulations that stifle economic growth while employing armies of paper pushers. When Trump moved to cut jobs and consolidate functions, the court swooped in, citing dubiously union-centric legal theories about worker protections or agency mandates. These rulings aren't about law, they're about power, specifically the power of a neo-Jacobin elite to shield its deep state bureaucratic allies from the consequences of a Trump presidency. Meanwhile, anti-DOGE Democrats in Congress have cheered on this judicial overreach, clutching their pearls at the thought of crony political foot soldier federal workers losing their cushy gigs. These are the same politicians who decry income inequality while defending six-figure salaries for mid-level functionaries who spend their days drafting memos no one reads. Their hypocrisy is galling. They claim to champion the little guy, yet their real loyalty lies with the entrenched deep state D.C. swamp creatures who thrive on taxpayer largesse. Together, the activist courts and their Democrat enablers have created a firewall around the administrative state, daring Trump to find a way through. Enter the transfer gambit. Under federal law, the president, as head of the executive branch, has broad authority to manage the workforce of government agencies. This includes the power to reassign employees to different locations, provided the moves align with operational needs, quote-unquote. Trump could exploit this authority to target the most recalcitrant anti-reform elements within the bureaucracy, those careerists who clog the system with resistance, leak to the press, or slow-walk directives they dislike ideologically. By transferring these malcontents to remote outposts, think desolate field offices in Alaska, rural North Dakota, the sweltering Texas border, or even Guam and American Samoa, they'd face a stark choice: uproot their lives and families to places with little appeal, or resign and seek greener pastures elsewhere. It's a blunt instrument, to be sure, but one that could break the back of the resistance without firing a single shot. The beauty of this approach lies in its legality. The courts, for all their activism, would struggle to block such transfers. Precedents like United States versus Fausto affirm that federal personnel decisions fall squarely within the executive discretion, and judges have historically been loath to micromanage agency staffing. Even the most zealous anti-Trump jurist would find it hard to argue that a transfer to, say, a customs service outpost in Montana violates some sacred constitutional principle. The Democrats would howl, of course, accusing Trump of weaponizing his authority, but their outrage would ring hollow. After all, they've spent years cheering when their presidents shuffled personnel to reward loyalists and punish dissenters. And consider the practical impact. The federal workforce, numbering over 2 million civilian employees, is riddled with dead weight. Agencies like the EPA employ thousands whose primary function seems to be dreaming up new ways to harass small businesses, while the redundant Department of Education churns out edicts that burden local school boards without improving outcomes. Trump's DOGE agenda aims to slash these ranks by at least 20%, saving billions and redirecting resources to priorities like border security and infrastructure. But every time he moves to cut, the courts slap injunctions, and the bureaucrats dig in, knowing their Democrat patrons have their backs. Transfers sidestep this quagmire entirely. If a mid-level EPA drone in D.C. suddenly finds herself reassigned to a crumbling office in Barrow, Alaska, odds are she'll quit rather than pack her snow boots. Multiply that by a few thousand, and the attrition starts to add up, quietly, efficiently, and without the legal fanfare of mass layoffs. Critics will cry foul, claiming this tactic punishes workers for simply doing their jobs. But let's be real. Many of these workers aren't serving the public. They're serving themselves, coasting on a gerrymandered job security while undermining a duly elected president. The federal government isn't a welfare program. It's a tool to execute the people's will. If employees can't stomach Trump's vision, voted for by a plurality of Americans and a majority of the voters at that, they don't belong there. And if the courts won't let Trump fire them outright, he's well within his rights to make their lives uncomfortable enough to leave voluntarily, just like those self-deporting illegal immigrants now leaving the country. The logistics are daunting, but doable. The General Services Administration could identify understaffed field offices in low-demand regions, places where the cost of living is cheap, but the quality of life is, shall we say, more rustic, requiring more self-sufficiency than life in an urban center. Think dying industrial towns, isolated military bases, or border zones plagued by heat and dust, poisonous snakes and scorpions. Trump could frame these moves as rebalancing the federal workforce to meet national needs, say, bolstering immigration enforcement in Texas or supporting rural economic development in the Midwest. The spin writes itself. We're putting federal resources where they're needed most. The courts might grumble, but they'd have little ground to intervene. The political fallout would be fierce. Democrats would flood the airwaves with sob stories about displaced workers packing their Lexuses to leave the Beltway, painting Trump as a heartless tyrant. The media, always eager to amplify the narrative, would run profiles of teary-eyed bureaucrats, venti Starbucks macchiatos in hand, forced to abandon their suburban McMansions for lesser accommodations in more environmentally pristine areas of our republic. But Trump thrives on such backlash. It's his oxygen. He'd counter with rallies, pointing out how these victims were the same do-nothing government feed trough leeches who spent years obstructing his first term. The base would eat it up, and swing voters, tired of government waste, would approvingly nod along. The real test would be staying power. If Trump can weather the initial storm and rack up enough resignations, the bureaucracy would start to crack. Seeing their ranks thin, anti-Trump agency heads might finally get the message and fall into line with the DOGE agenda. The courts, meanwhile, would lose their leverage. Hard to issue injunctions protecting jobs that no longer exist. It's a war of attrition, and Trump's got the stomach for it and the cards to play the hand. In the end, this isn't about cruelty. It's about results. The activist courts and anti-DOGE Democrats have made it clear they'll fight tooth and nail to preserve the deep state bureaucratic status quo. Trump, ever the disruptor, and armed with a mandate by the American people, doesn't have to play their game. By wielding the transfer power, he can outmaneuver the judges, outlast the bureaucrats, and deliver on his promise to drain the swamp, one remote reassignment at a time. The American people didn't elect him to coddle the administrative state. They elected him to tame it, to conquer it, to dismantle it. And if the courts won't let him cut the fat, he can just ship it off to the hinterlands until it quits on its own. It's not like the private sector doesn't do this all the time. When we come back, our segment on America's Third Watch, broadcast nationally from our flagship station, WGUL, AM 930 and FM 93.7 in Tampa, Florida.
You're listening to Underground USA.
Wokeism is a threat to the very foundations of our great nation and to the very principles of liberty and justice. The goal of wokeism is to divide us, pitting Americans against one another based on race, gender, and identity. This ideology undermines free speech and open dialogue, which are the bedrock of our republic. It promotes censorship and cancels anyone who dares to challenge its extreme agenda. We must stand against this cultural Marxism and protect our constitutional rights. Say no to wokeism.
News, insight, passion. AM 930, The Answer.
A happy Monday and happy St. Patrick's Day.
Short and be gone, Mr. Kyle Warren.
Well, thank you very much. I love it. That sounds great. Thank you, Frank.
Just thought I'd get that out of the way.
No, I do. I think that's cool. And I tell you what, Frank, like I was just talking about here in the intro here, there's a lot going on out there. But President Trump decided that it was time to have the U.S. military show what it can do. And they had some pretty comprehensive targeting packages against the Houthi rebels. And we understand that many were taken out, some of these Houthi leaders, as it were.
Well, and add to that the leader of ISIS in Iraq. You know, they took him out with a strategic hit too on the same day. So, you know, when you are declared enemy of the United States, things happen. And the Houthis have been declared a terrorist entity and an enemy of the United States. And when you attack ships and shipping lanes, especially U.S. naval warships, there are going to be repercussions. You'll notice that the usual suspects on the left, when it comes to being the globalist policeman, they don't really scream about the U.S. getting into any conflicts, do they?
Nope.
No, they want those shipping lanes to remain open because that deals with trade and it deals with the oil that goes through those shipping lanes and everything else. Plus, they don't have a leg to stand on because the act of piracy is something that's actually spoken about in our founding documents. We don't tolerate it. Piracy is punishable by an act of war. So we have free rein to respond when a recognized and declared terrorist entity, an enemy of the United States, attacks us. And I think everything that Donald Trump did, and he's thrown a lot of stuff at the Houthis, all warranted. And the idea that Iran came back and said there may be repercussions, smoked them out of their hole to have to admit that they're the ones that are funding them and supporting them. So once again, we have a world terrorist organization that's funded and supported by the state of Iran.
Yeah, precisely. And Frank, this whole thing, again, like you talked about, there are repercussions. And of course, and you also mentioned that, of course, they're a terrorist organization. Well, it's worth noting, too, that the Biden administration took them off that terrorist list, basically. And Lord only knows why.
Well, they're sympathetic. And I don't want to say like buddy sympathetic, but going back to the Obama administration, they had this foreign policy in the Middle East that was centered along this new crescent. They figured if they empowered the radical Islamist rulers over in the Middle East, it would balance things out and they wouldn't be so bent. It's just a really stunted way of thinking about foreign policy, but that's what the Obama administration put into place, and the Biden administration didn't change that at all. They continued that legacy on through the 4 years of that debacle. So they placated the mullahs of Iran. That's why they were throwing billions of dollars at them all the time and lifting sanctions. You know, they didn't go after ISIS the way Donald Trump did in Syria. They didn't support Israel in going after Hamas and Hezbollah. They enabled these bloodthirsty tyrants. So there's a completely different foreign policy in place, and it has to do with saying, if you act like a terrorist, you'll be eliminated like a terrorist. We're back to that.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
We may send special envoys to talk to you about issues like nuclear stuff on a second tier level, but that's because we want to help the world become a safer place. But make no mistake, we're not your friend. We're your enemy. And if you do stupid things, you're going to feel the fire of hell. And I fully support what the Trump administration is doing over there. For far too long, the Houthis have been getting away with being this little kid on the playground that throws rocks. Well, those days are over.
Yes, exactly right. And again, this also shows that Trump, while saying he doesn't want to get us into new wars or other wars, he's not afraid to flex the muscles here and, again, take out this threat that's been there for quite some time. And I think it just shows, again, he's resolute. He's not afraid. He's not afraid to take action.
Well, he's doing what must be done. I said this all the way back after 9/11. We missed a golden opportunity during the Bush administration, and I do fault him for this. There should have been a declared act of war against all international terrorist interests around the globe. They should have figured out how to do that verbiage and gotten it out there so all the bells and whistles of being able to use War Act powers against terror groups was on the table and not malleable by Congress.
Well, Frank, it's this law from 1798. It's called the Alien Enemies Act. President Trump's trying to deport these gang members out of the country. A judge says, no, wait a minute, you can't really do that. And then they said, well, we've already sent them out of the country. And so there's a dust up about that. What do you think?
Yeah, to translate it, the Trump administration said to the judge, bite me.
That's right.
That's pretty much what it was. He said that the planes had to turn around in the air. We came back and said, they're out of our airspace. And even the president of El Salvador got into it saying, oh, oops, too late. Yeah. So even foreign leaders understand that the black robe tyranny of the federal judiciary can't step in and start telling the executive branch what it can and cannot do. This was a Clinton appointee that put this out there, so this has to stop, and I believe the only way it's going to stop is if Mr. Trump pulls a page from the playbooks of people like Andrew Jackson and FDR and Abraham Lincoln and even Richard Nixon in saying, okay, that's your ruling, good for you. We're co-equal branches of government, so as Andrew Jackson said, okay, that's your opinion. Now enforce it.
Right.
Go ahead and give it a shot.
Right. Well, exactly. And of course, this whole thing, I mean, as a larger picture too, you've got the idea of trying to it literally inhibit the executive branch from carrying out its duties. One of those things, of course, is enforcing the law. Now, they'll point to this idea that typically, I think this law was used in time of war, but the Trump administration's going to be arguing that, well, wait a minute, these Tren de Agua gang members generally have ties to the Venezuelan president Maduro. So they do have some kind of international cachet here.
Well, they are a declared terrorist organization by the State Department, and Mr. Trump has declared a state of emergency at the border. So when you look at the law, it also has a provision. It says during times of war or times of invasion. And that's where the gray area argument comes in for legitimacy here. Mm-hmm. When you have massive numbers of people coming over the border to exist on your soil, and we're not talking just a couple 100,000, we're talking, I believe, up to 11 million. You can argue that by definition that's an invasion because it was done illegally. So he's within his purview here. And he can argue that all the way to the Supreme Court. And while he's arguing it, he can raise the flag of the middle finger to the lower bench federal justices who believe they've got the autonomy to interfere with the executive branch. Immigration policy and enforcement rests exclusively with the executive branch. So right. This is not about just overstepping and overreaching. It's a blatant violation of the separation of powers.
Well, sure, exactly. And if this were being done to a Democrat president, just for sake of argument, it would be, well, wait a minute, you are impeding the executive, you are doing this. But for Trump, it's like, well, Trump's a dictator, he's Hitler, blah, blah, blah. Everybody can try to stop him. And again, it just causes more of these issues.
There would be a boatload of people in the U.S. House getting behind provisions like one U.S. representative has entered into record to impeach the federal judge who did this. We have one Republican with a spine who's doing the right thing. Here's a judge who is existing on the bench in bad behavior. And that's the litmus test for the judiciary. You can serve lifetime appointments during good behavior. When you are usurping the separation of powers, you exist not in good behavior, and that opens yourself up to being impeached. And the first time, Victor Davis Hanson talks about this with deporting illegals and having their student visas and their existence at college campuses revoked with deportations to follow. You do that a few times, and suddenly the BS stops because people understand you're serious about saying no. So we need to impeach a couple federal judges who are doing this stuff so that they understand they are not untouchable. They do not wear the black robes of tyrants. They do not have autonomy just to establish and dictate law. It's not the way it is. They have a role. It's important. But you have to stay within the boundaries of what the Constitution gave you. And if you're executing politics instead of constitutionality, you are stepping over that line that blurs the separation of powers.
Oh, sure. And of course, the way it's spun in the media or in instances like this, right, is that somehow Trump is defying the judicial branch of government. Basically, he is going against what a judge says because that perception is out there that anything a judge says or does is automatically in sync with the Constitution and the separation of powers. And I appreciate the way you're talking about this, Frank, because again, it goes to bad behavior or things that don't seem to go together with the way our system is actually set up.
We have a system of checks and balances for three co-equal branches of government. And when one acts in an unconstitutional manner, the other branches have a duty, not an option, but a duty to defy it. That's basically what the premise for nullification is. And that's exactly what people, like I said, Andrew Jackson, Abraham Lincoln, and FDR, the left wants to wax lamentations for FDR and everything that he did, including court packing. Well, he defied the judiciary, saying we're not doing that. Lincoln did it with the suspension of habeas corpus, and it raised a stink to this day. Did he have the right? He told the judiciary, your ruling was unconstitutional. I'm not accepting it. Mm-hmm. We're in some dire straits right here, and I need to keep the union together. So your decision is irresponsible and reckless, and we're not recognizing it. You could say it, but like Andrew Jackson said, try to enforce it. Go right ahead. And I think that needs to be a declared. Mr. Trump needs to come out and give a mini history lesson, like we're talking about right here, to the American people. Mm-hmm. That it's not without precedent to look at a tyrannical federal judge and say, you can say it all you want, but we recognize it as unconstitutional. And until you can put that through the Supreme Court, I'm not going to listen to it. And even then, I'll argue whether or not I'm going to follow that by saying go ahead and try to enforce it if we still believe on a legal basis it's unconstitutional. And then, we sat here and in four minutes, we put together 3 arguments for why it's unconstitutional mm-hmm. in the separation of powers and where the power lies for immigration policy and enforcement. So, just because the media wants to scream about it and Democrats want to whine and kick and throw a temper tantrum doesn't mean they're right because they're the loudest voice in the room. Somebody mm-hmm. needs to take the batteries out of their megaphone.
Well, Frank, like you're just saying right here, I mean, this kind of discussion and this kind of subject matter and this kind of issue is at the very lifeblood of how the United States actually functions. And unfortunately, there's not enough of this kind of discussion going on because there's so many knee-jerk reactions. A judge said this, and to even question that is somehow now, demonstrating that you're the dictator, but that's not really the case.
Well, and this speaks to what we talk about all the time about history and civics not being taught in high school and even junior high school, and especially in college. They're teaching ideology and not history and not civics and not government and not the ideology of the isms. They have to do that. So if they're not going to do it, we have to have discussions like this that have some historical precedent based on fact so people can go, whoa, wait a minute. I guess Tapper was wrong.
I'm worried that Trump is on the edge of creating a civil war. He alluded to it more than once. He alluded to the fact that if he did not get reelected, that there could be a civil war. What does Trump expect? Oh, I believe he expects violence. I believe he expects confrontation. I believe he's working toward a civil war.
Well, you heard, I'm sure, that quote there from Maxine Waters, where she talked about, Trump's trying to drive us to a civil war, but the real civil war is in the Democrat Party as they are now proceeding to eat their own and doing it quite publicly, it seems.
Now, there's a new poll out, and again, I preface this by saying, what I think about opinion polls, but when it's glaringly obvious that it's kind of accurate, you have to note those things. New poll out by CNN that says that the people in the Democratic Party see the leader of that political entity as AOC by 10%.
Yeah. Wow.
It goes AOC and Bernie Sanders. Schumer's down there at 2%. AOC gets 10%. So that tells you what the rank and file poll respondents, and CNN is targeting their core base, which is the far left. But that's where their mindset is. And if you want to validate that, think about what they're arguing about when it came to the funding of government. They're talking about changes in spending from what the Biden administration had, because they cut, I believe it's $9 billion for non-defense spending and boosted defense spending by 6.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. What are we finding when it comes to waste over at DOGE? We're not talking 9 billion and 6 billion. We're always talking hundreds of billions. And they're up in arms about that. We can't have that stopped. USAID must be reinstated with all its funding so their hundreds of billions of dollars can be wasted around the world and given to NGOs that are really just clearinghouses for our political operatives come election time. So you'll have a civil war within your political party for 9 billion and 6 billion, but you'll go to the mats on making sure that we can waste taxpayer dollars to the tunes of hundreds of billions of dollars. You know, people need to point that out. They'll shut down government over $15 billion. And really just $6 billion because they're cutting the $9 billion. But they have no problem wasting $200 billion?
Exactly. But there's a desperation that's going on there, Frank. You know, I think they really believe that, I mean, they're losing constituents, or they're losing people who believe them when they say, well, we're fighting for you, et cetera, et cetera. I think people think much more that Trump is actually fighting for them, not just what he's already been through, but what he's doing right now. And now you've got the Democrat Party, again, especially some of these younger Democrat officials or members of Congress like AOC, but also like Jasmine Crockett, saying the most outlandish things.
Yeah, the neo-Jacobins of the far left Democrat Party. And I touch on this in the closing part of what's happening on undergroundusa.com this morning. Even NBC, and again, I'm not a big fan of the poll because you can fashion the questions to get the response that you want. But when an outlet is from the camp that is asking the questions of the respondents, and NBC is a left-leaning organization, we all know that. When they come out with, well, Trump's got the highest approval ratings he's ever had, and the approval rating for Democrats is down at like 23. You know, when your own side is taking a poll of your own people and those are the results, you don't double down on it by saying, hey, our titular head is AOC. Why? Because she does a punching video better? You know, she's getting shouted down in her own town halls back in Brooklyn by her own constituents, and they want to run her against Schumer? That's what they're floating in Congress. They want to run her against Schumer in the Senate. Now, I'm no fan of Chuck Schumer, but he's light years ahead of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez when it comes to political prowess.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so Democrats, your leadership, and I know that the leadership is the problem here when it comes to the who's picking who comes off the bench. David Hogg as the vice chairman is just one of the most ridiculous things that has ever happened in American history.
Yeah.
He's got absolutely no business in that position. But when you have leadership that's imbecilic, you're going to get candidates that are either extremely radical or also imbecilic. And in AOC, we've got a combination of both. So, Democrats, you got your butts handed to you last time in an election. Maybe you want to veer from the radical stuff and get back to what your own summit in Virginia last month declared needed to happen. You need to be a more moderate party or risk going out of existence.
Well, yeah. Well, exactly. I mean, do you see, Frank, any indication that there would be a real split in the sense that you've got some sort of new phase of the Democrat Party that's incredibly far left, and some that would want to try to go to that more moderate tack? But I just don't know if that's even possible. I mean, they have so radicalized themselves, and they've taken themselves out of I think everyday Americans' view, because most people want to be successful. They want to live the American dream. and they don't really adhere to that extremism.
Yeah, and the wilderness they have cast themselves to is self-imposed. They didn't need to go extreme left. That's neo-Marxian. The entire political ideology that the far left uses and employs in everything they do and every policy that they advance is based in Marxism. If you understand Karl Marx and what he wanted, that's what the progressive movement is. It always has been. History proves that. And in the day in the age of being able to go on to ChatGPT or Grok on X and say, hey, explain Karl Marx to me. And you get 1,000 words on what kind of a tyrant and ideologue he was. There's no excuse not to understand what Marxism is. And you can identify it with the Democrat Party unless, again, you're an imbecile. So is there a possibility that they'll shift? There's always a possibility. It happened during the Reagan years with the Reagan Democrats. But it takes someone with a spine who's able to stand up against the loudmouth busybodies of the far left, like Ayok and Crockett, who's another imbecile, an opportunistic imbecile, I might add, because she sees all the marginalization of the squad, and she thinks now's her time. Talk about an idiot. Wow. But yeah, it can happen. And then you also have to call the media on it. And that's where the hard part is. They're empowered to believe that they understand things. And this entire mainstream media complex filled with bubbleheads who because they wear makeup well and can read a teleprompter, believe they're intelligent on the issues of politics and current events and geopolitics. We've got to recognize the fact that they're just performers who read teleprompters. And the people who are crafting the narratives are the people who load the words into the teleprompters. They never get in front of the camera, and you never know who they are, or who their influences are. That's the big one. That's where the power is with the media, and they carry the water for the radical left.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you mentioned, Frank, of course, this idea of Marxism, and getting back to the quote that we had at the top of the segment from Maxine Waters about Trump expects violence, quote unquote. Well, you get violence when you get Marxism trying to take over and do what we've seen it do in history here. That's where that would come from, I hate to say. But Frank Salvato, undergroundusa.com, author of the book Nullification. Thank you, my friend. We'll talk to you again on Friday.
Stay low, my friend, and happy St. Patrick's Day.
You're listening to Underground USA.
A free and independent media is the backbone of our great republic. So it's crucial to have media outlets that aren't influenced by big tech censorship or the leftist mainstream media complex. But that means supporting journalistic outlets that bring us the truth without spinning facts to push a narrative. For less than the cost of a cup of coffee once a month at Starbucks, you can support the free speech mission of undergroundusa.com, an independent, reader-supported, and sometimes irreverent podcast and publication that gives you the real story without the bias. Go to undergroundusa.com/UUSA. That's undergroundusa.com/UUSA to receive a 25% discount on an annual subscription, bringing every new podcast and article directly into your email inbox, circumventing the censors and fact-checkers. Remember, knowledge is power, and staying informed is one of the best ways to protect our republic. Go out there and seek the truth, my friends. Subscribe to undergroundusa.com today.
I've said it 1,000 times, and I'll say it again. Political opinion polling, for the most part, is a sham. The questions are often rigged, twisted, and sculpted to herd respondents into the answers the pollsters, often lackeys of the left, want to hear. But when the results come back overwhelmingly lopsided, especially from outlets that usually shill for the losing side, it's worth a second glance. Case in point. An NBC News poll dropped on Sunday, and it's a glorious gut punch to the sanctimonious far left and their Democrat puppets. 3 months into his second term, President Trump has soared to the highest approval rating of his tenure as Commander-in-Chief. More Americans say the country is on the right track than at any point since 2004, back when the world wasn't drowned in woke dogma and Democrat hysterics. The survey shows voters overwhelmingly believe Trump's delivering the right kind of change on the issues that matter, even tariffs, that sacred cow the left loves to demonize. More Americans back his trade policy shakeup, 41%, than whine about it, 38%, per NBC's own numbers. On border security, where the far left's open borders fetish has wreaked havoc, 56% cheer Trump's moves as a positive shift. On slashing government bloat, 47% approve, while a measly 29% cling to their big government blankie. Even on Ukraine and NATO, where the elitist left and their media lapdogs have screeched nonstop, more respondents salute Trump's approach than clutch their pearls in opposition. And inflation? The polls show voters are giving him a pass, despite the Democrat machine's endless bleating about economic Armageddon. Then there's the Department of Government Efficiency, DOGE, led by Elon Musk, a glorious middle finger to the wasteful, corrupt swamp the left worships. A whopping 61% of Americans say it's a net positive, with just 4%, probably the same granola-crunching socialists who think money grows on trees, insisting there's no need to trim the fat. 1/3, 33%, want DOGE to dig deeper into the cesspool of government waste, fraud, and abuse, while 28% call it a long overdue reckoning. That 61% steamrolls the 33% of whining liberals who clutch their chai lattes and sob that DOGE's cuts are reckless and must be stopped. Trump's still a lightning rod, no doubt. Republicans give him 90% approval ratings, deservedly so, while Democrats muster a pathetic 4% for approval. That's the widest partisan gap in 80 years, and it's a neon sign flashing the intellectual bankruptcy of the Democrat Party. Two takeaways scream for attention. First, if most voters think Trump's steering the country in the right direction, all the left's venom towards him is just performative tantrum throwing, a hissy fit over his personality, not his results. In a free nation, which we're still clinging to despite the left's best efforts, you don't have to braid friendship bracelets with someone to respect what they're doing for you. Only the shallow, feelings-obsessed drones of the far left can't grasp that. Second, if just 4% of Democrats approve of Trump's second-term performance while everyone else sees the light, what does that say about the Democrat Party? They're a cult of stubborn, emotion-drunk ideologues, so blinded by their hatred they'd rather torch the country than admit he's winning, that the American people are better off than under the neo-Marxist bullshit sold to us as progress in the Clinton, Obama, and Biden years. Is America ideologically gridlocked? You bet. The far left and their Democrat stooges have dragged us away from facts, reason, and truth, chaining us instead to the propaganda mill of the mainstream media, the same clowns who've spent years peddling fear and utopian fairy tales. But this poll? It's a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, Americans are finally rubbing the sleep from their eyes, seeing through the hollow promises of the radical left and their Democrat mouthpieces. There's a long road ahead to rekindle liberty's fire in this nation. But this is a start, and as Martha Stewart might say, that's a good thing.
You're listening to Underground USA.
The foundation of our great nation lies in our unwavering commitment to freedom, and at its core is the principle of free speech. It's not just a right, but a duty to speak our minds, respectfully debate, and challenge ideas. Today, free speech is under attack by the forces of the deep state and the globalists. We must all do our part to protect free speech, for without it, we'd be lost in a sea of woke conformity and censorship. We have the right. Protect it.
If you like the podcast, please head on over to undergroundusa.com and sign up for our Substack. It brings every new podcast and article directly into your email inbox. And do your part to safeguard our republic. Talk politics, current events, and religion with your family, friends, colleagues, and acquaintances. When we have these rational, calm, fact-based conversations, when we share our feelings on these things with our friends and colleagues and family, we realize we've got more in common than we do in difference. And that puts us at odds with the balkanizers of the deep state who want to make sure that we're divided into little tribes so they can manipulate us come election time. We don't have to play their game anymore. You're listening to Underground USA. No fear, no wokeism, no political correctness. My name is Frank Salvato.